And once again, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Los Angeles Birders webinar for Thanksgiving week 2022. And after saying that, I'd like to ask you for your support, your lab membership. Please join Lab. Your lab membership helps support live webinars like this. It helps us store recorded webinars to be available hopefully forever on our website and YouTube, and it helps with local field ornithology and community science projects, and it helps with scholarships for young birders. Lots and lots went out for scholarships and other special projects such as migrant spots and all that. And with that, I'd like to introduce Susan Gilliland, who will introduce our speaker for tonight. Susan.
Okay, thanks, Ron. Well, it's our great pleasure to welcome back Andy Birch tonight. Before moving to California from the UK in the early 1990s, Andy birded extensively across Europe and Asia. A birder as long as he can remember, he became especially fascinated by bird migration. After high school, Andy moved to Eilat, Israel, to experience what is considered the premier migration hotspot in the Western Palearctic, a place where nearly every Western Palearctic and many Eastern Palearctic passerines migrate through. Shortly afterwards, he then made the trek out to Beidaha, China, considered one of the finest hotspots for Eastern Palearctic migration. These days, with a young family, his birding life is a bit more pedestrian, but he birds extensively around Los Feliz and Glendale, enjoying local migration. Andy is also a well-known illustrator of birds, and over the past 30 years, Andy has illustrated identification plates for field guides and created brilliant illustrations for the front covers of major birding magazines in North America and Europe. Andy and Sin-T Lee have a new book coming out on April 4th, 2023, The Field Guide to North American Flycatchers, Epidinacs, and Peewees. So without further ado, please welcome Andy Birch.
Thank you very much, Susan. There were some very hard place names in there. I think you did a fantastic job. So thank you. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. Let me just move.
Yeah, it looks great.
Good, thank you. So trying to predict the next vagrants, especially from a region as far-flung as this, is a fool's errand. So this evening should be taken with the spirit it's intended, and as the title suggests, kind of preposterous. Instead, we're taking a moment to celebrate some of the amazing vagrants from this region that have already occurred, not only in our county, but also the state. And we'll take a moment to dream about those that haven't been discovered yet. In my attempt to sort of see how many have occurred in recent years, I came up with 17 passerine individuals of Palearctic origin in LA County since 2000. It's quite an impressive number, especially when you look at the range maps of some of these species. In recent years, however, it feels like we average, almost 1 to 2 per year. Indeed, just in the past 5 years, mainland LA birders have been treated to 2 dusky warblers, 1 wood warbler, 1 red-flanked bluetail, which was the second county record, 5 red-throated pipits, a Japonicus Siberian pipit, 2 white wagtails, and if you were lucky enough to be on San Clemente, you could throw in another dusky warbler, white wagtail, Eurasian Wryneck, and a northern wheated too. Now that's a lot of Palearctic passerine vagrants just in the last 5 years. Many of these species understandably get short shrift in North American field guides, and 20 years ago, would have been unheard of as potentially occurring in the lower 48. So clearly LA birders now need to be armed with the knowledge on how to ID these birds, but also be aware of what could be the next preposterous Palearctic passerine to be in the county. So we're looking at passerines whose usual range is this Palearctic region in red here. We'll look at vagrant species that have already occurred, but also look at what might be next. And it should be noted that some of these species breed on the eastern edge of this range. So some like blue throat, red-throated pipit, eastern yellow wagtail, Arctic warbler, actually have a breeding range that extends to the very western edge of Alaska. So not truly Palearctic only birds. And then on the other extreme, the wood warbler in Long Beach is particularly remarkable in this context, not just because it is a first for the lower 48, all the previous records have been from islands off Alaska, but because it is almost exclusively confined to Europe, with the eastern edge of its range, reaching the Ural Mountains. So assuming the bird originated from that eastern edge of the range, a straight line of more than 9,500 kilometers to Long Beach, essentially on the opposite side of the planet from where it was born. This fall, there was also an icterine warbler on Gamble, a species that is also exclusively Eastern European. And so another remarkable vagrant. And amazingly, as I was preparing this deck, a willow warbler was discovered a couple of days after the wood warbler, this time in Marin in Northern California. So here's some essential reference material, all are highly recommended if you want to be better prepared and armed, or if you just have an interest. The Collins Bird Guide is a general field guide to birds of Europe. It's beautifully illustrated, excellent summaries and identification details. It's a birds of Europe guide, so it would include birds like our famous wood warbler, but also many of the same Asian, Siberian vagrants that occur in Europe also occur as vagrants to the west coast of North America too. And so they're covered in this book as well. And there's also an app for this if you've moved away from books, as many people have. There's also Rare Birds of North America by Howell, Lewington, and Russell. It's beautifully illustrated by Lewington. It's more of a coffee table book than a field guide, but there's a lot of detailed ID notes on those vagrants that have already occurred in North America, as well as a really excellent summary of vagrancy theories. Then there's the Birds of Gamble and St. Lawrence Island. It's a Western Field Ornithologist publication written by Paul Lehman. Comprehensive coverage of all the bird life of the region. Lehman, who'd been a regular 1 to 2 week tour leader to Gamble, started to do more extended 1 to 2 month stays, starting in 1999 through 2018. By the end of 2018, he had accumulated almost 1,000 days of coverage there and was responsible for finding many North American firsts. I think the total is up into the double digits. And there's also another Western Field Ornithologist book, Rare Birds of California, which is essential reading for anybody who's interested in vagrants. It gives a lot of great detail on all the vagrants, not just the Palearctic ones that have occurred in the state. And then there's one last book that I don't have here. It's very new. It's called Vagrancy in Birds by Lees and Gilroy, which also provides an excellent summary as well as new theories about what causes some of these birds to wander. So is there any pattern to where and when these birds are occurring in our area? Well, in terms of when, it's concentrated in the fall. There's the odd outlier, like a spring eyebrow thrush in Kern, but fall and winter is basically the time. And this map is only looking at those fall-winter records. Looking at this region as a whole, I could have and probably should have extended the map further west to include more of Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo, which have also had dusky and Arctic / Kamchatka warblers and various other goodies. And probably would have been useful to go a little further south, all the way to Baja, which has had a number of vagrants like little bunting, yellow-browed warbler. But I had to draw the line somewhere. I did not include red-throated pipit. There are so many records that it would clutter the map. And red-throated is also quite habitat specific. You would find a massive cluster around Ventura, San Diego, where there's appropriate habitat, such as, sod farms. I did, however, include white wagtails because there are fewer records. So looking at this, there's a small cluster in the desert, also the area that had that spring eyebrow thrush. But in general, as you'd expect from most vagrants of any origin, coastal is usually best and islands even better. Although perhaps a little surprising that the wealth of San Clemente Island hasn't actually been shared really with the other Channel Islands. There's a cluster around LA, Orange County, a number of birds inland even, like the Sepulveda dusky warbler, a wheatear in La Mirada, and the wintering bluetail in downtown Los Angeles. So again, ignoring San Clemente for a moment, it's certainly clear that the coastal slope of LA County does very well for these vagrants. And what is perhaps interesting is the increase in records over the last 20 years. Again, setting aside San Clemente, the lion's share coming from that cluster in mainland LA and Orange County. So what are the factors that can cause some species to be more prone to wander from their typical migration to Southeast Asia and turn up in Southern California? Well, Howe defines vagrancy in its simplest form as basically birds being in areas they normally don't occur. Now, given that we don't understand fully how migration works, it's not surprising that the causes of vagrancy really aren't very well understood either. One thing we do know, however, is that young birds tend to be more prone to vagrancy than adults. Migrating birds seem to use a variety of tools and resources to navigate that include celestial, geomagnetic, but there are other factors as well, such as barometric, light, sound, and perhaps even smell. Some migrations are learned while others are innate. In species where adults migrate separately from the young maybe have an inbuilt clock and a compass telling them the direction to fly, and after so much flying time has elapsed, when to stop. So a young dusky warbler with no previous experience of migration can take off from the Kamchatka Peninsula and fly accurately on a 4,000-mile journey to its wintering grounds in Southeast Asia. And along the way, there may even be course changes built in after a certain amount of flying hours. However, in this scenario, birds don't know their actual position, and they may not correct their course if weather has caused them to drift. This can then result in them moving far off course. Now, the evolutionary benefit to these lost birds is new migration, wintering, breeding areas that can get discovered and ultimately benefit the species. Howe speculates that might be happening with red-throated pipit, which is slowly starting to find new wintering areas, perhaps in Western North America. And it certainly happened with an Asian pipit, Richard's pipit. This is a regular vagrant, or what we should really call a very rare migrant to Western Europe. It should typically follow a similar migration to dusky warbler wintering in Southeast Asia from its breeding range in Russia. So birds in Europe are not within its typical range at all. But as winter conditions in Europe have become more favorable, leading to increased winter survival and a successful return journey and reproduction of those individuals that initially reached Europe in the autumn and then returned, there is now actually a small Western European wintering population that's been set up. And there was a study done with tracking that showed that these birds moved back to their native breeding area. So this really sort of illustrates that vagrancy may have an underestimated role in the emergence of new migratory routes and adaptation to global change in migratory birds. A more refined system of migration may be a bicoordinate system in which birds use two coordinates to determine their position. This system would be used by birds that migrated before, hence the reason why vagrants don't usually include many adults. This abstract we see here is from a paper that studied how adult Eurasian reed warblers tested during autumn migration in Russia were exposed to a change in declination, which was equivalent to a virtual magnetic displacement to Scotland, very far away from where they came from. The adult migrants responded by changing their heading, consistent with compensation for the virtual magnetic displacement. Juvenile migrants that had not yet established a navigational map also reoriented, but they did it in a random manner. Sorry about that. Also, population size at the source is a huge factor, and you combine that with distance and direction of migration, it will determine vagrancy likelihood in species. As a species range expands or contracts, it will certainly influence why it may become more regular as a vagrant. But another important factor is detectability, and the latter is often influenced by weather. Poor weather forces birds to make landfall, which leads to detection. But the bird's appearance and behavior will determine, how likely it is to be detected. Land birds migrating over an ocean will become concentrated on islands, It's no coincidence that Southeast Farallon Island and San Clemente hold a large proportion of Asian passerine vagrants for California. And I've not actually included any locustella warblers in our webinar tonight. You know, these are the grasshopper warblers, and this lanceolated warbler shown here on the screen, which has actually been recorded in California on Farallon. If you thought the recent sedge wren in Griffith Park was difficult to see, these birds are the black rails of passerines. They usually won't flush, they won't call, you know, they disappear into the grass, they run around like a mouse under the vegetation. I mean, your only chance of seeing one of these is if you happen to be lucky enough to be there when, you know, a bander pulls one out of the net, or perhaps you come across a window strike. So Howell breaks down vagrancy into a number of categories, and there are two or three of those that pertain to the fall Asian passerine vagrancy for us here in California. The first category is drift vagrancy. Birds only begin their migration in good conditions. However, if they meet poor weather after liftoff, they will need to stop and land. So if they're over the ocean, they can't. So they either turn around and head back to where they came from if it's early in the night. If not, and they're too far out over the ocean, they basically have to press on. This latter strategy, no doubt, leads to high mortality. They may try to make course adjustments, but if they're tired, they possibly just give up trying to make course adjustments and just go or drift with the prevailing wind, wherever it may be taking them. So obviously weather's going to play a huge part in this drift vagrancy. Howell refers to the Pacific North American Teleconnection, PNA, that sets up over the North Pacific. The PNA influences regional weather by affecting the strength and location of the East Asian jet stream, and subsequently the weather it delivers to North America. So when the PNA is in its negative phase, storm systems originating from Far Eastern Russia and the Bering Sea, they take a path towards the west coast of North America, including obviously California. And such conditions may contribute to increased numbers of these Palearctic passerines reaching our shores. Howell also does cite a statistical correlation between the negative phase and the occurrence of dusky warbler, white wagtail, red-throated pipit in California. So if a bird is swept up in weather across the Pacific, how far can it actually migrate on a fuel load? Well, banding data from Southeast Farallon showed that Asian passerines banded there may have been on the light side, but they were still within the range. So if they had flown directly across the Pacific, it was a journey that they appeared to be able to handle okay. Or perhaps it indicates an arrival point further north and they refueled as they moved down the west coast offshore. In September 2012, both common cuckoo and Arctic/Kamchatka warbler were found in coastal central California after a period of storms that spanned the North Pacific, with winds blowing at around 100 kilometers an hour from Kamchatka to the west coast of California. It's a distance of about 3,500 miles, which is actually no greater than many North American vagrants do when they cross the Atlantic to reach Western Europe. So it's certainly a journey that many of these birds seem to be able to do. And so thinking back to our wood warbler, this is how it looked in the days prior to both the wood warbler and the Northern California willow warbler being found. That satellite image up there is from October 9. It's showing this sort of circular low pressure system offshore, which would typically be weather, contain wind, etc. The rest of the maps move sequentially from October 11th to the 15th, right before its discovery. That red area is a ridge of high pressure that's blocking that low. You know, typically, you wouldn't have that ridge and the low would move through, depositing rain across the Pacific Northwest. But it was being blocked and instead redirecting some of that weather towards California. And specifically for our region, you know, this was coupled with the low, which you can also see in the map, over Southern California. You know, some of you may remember there was rain and even lightning strikes around that period right before the wood warbler was found. And no doubt that combination would have forced offshore migrants to make landfall and brought fantastic conditions for observing vagrants along the coast, and especially the Channel Islands. As Kimball had mentioned earlier, it was actually a fantastic period on Avalon at that time, but also some of the other Channel Islands north of there had unprecedented numbers of rarities. So if we take that map I showed earlier of sort of the general distribution of birds in our area, and we lay them out year by year against the P&A, you know, perhaps there is a correlation between increasing frequency of vagrants during the last 10 years when the P&A seems to be more prevalent and in its negative phase. 2017, 2018 was a very good period for vagrants from that region, and LA especially. It does seem to sort of correlate somewhat with that extended negative phase. However, it's not actually reflected at the earlier end of the graph around 2000, 2001. The next category of vagrancy is misorientation. So it's possible that some birds may have faulty built-in compass and clocks, leading them to travel in the wrong direction, or they travel in the right direction for the wrong period of time. A well-known aspect of misorientation is reverse migration, where a bird migrates in the opposite direction that it normally should. As can be seen from our poor young dusky warbler here, instead of heading southwest from its breeding grounds on the Kamchatka Peninsula to its wintering grounds in Southeast Asia, this reverse migrant heads in the exact opposite northeast direction along this red line. Such a course would take it to the west coast and on our model here, directly to LA County. Here is also an example of how a wood warbler might be a reverse migrant to California. A bird breeding on the eastern edge of its range, instead of migrating southwest to winter in Africa, heads northeast along this red line, which would put it on a trajectory to far northeast Russia, crossing maybe Alaska, Gamble, and ultimately out across the Pacific off the west coast of California, where perhaps the inclement weather and storms that occurred a few days before it was discovered forced it to make landfall and put a temporary halt to its migration. Perhaps after it left us, it continued on down to Baja, where it may even choose to overwinter, you know, which would line up nicely with other fall Asian vagrants that have been discovered there. Another form of misorientation is something called mirror image misorientation. It was proposed by California ornithologist DeSante. In this particular example, the bird should be migrating 40 degrees west of south and instead migrates 40 degrees east of south. So if you imagine the vertical green line is north-south, that red line is the mirror image of the normal migration route in black. Howe speculates eastern yellow wagtail could be a good example of this. The early fall, mid-September records that are concentrated in California may be breeders from Alaska with mirror image misorientation, and the later birds in October that are concentrated further north in Alaska and the Alaska Islands are in fact reverse migrants from further west in Russia. And one more factor to consider is just, as I've mentioned before, the population changes. As ranges change and spread out, it can also lead to more vagrancy. And whether the bird is a drift or a misoriented migrant, we cannot ignore the human influence too. Ship assistance is definitely a dirty term for listers. The purists would like to think their birds made it unaided, but the reality is we often just don't know. If a bird is desperate for survival and rests on anything, even large human trash or a boat floating in the ocean, does that disqualify it? Well, I won't answer that. I leave it to the birders. But the bird is using all the resources at its disposal to survive, and finding rest and refuge on a boat would be expected if it encounters one along its route. While insect eaters may not last on a boat for an entire voyage across the Pacific, many seed eaters could. And these commercial ships are huge, like small islands, and they're easily spotted by a migrant bird. And there are a lot of them. A migrant being swept across the Pacific will certainly have options along its route here. Perhaps many or most of them have had assistance somewhere along the way. This hawfinch was photographed by Peter Leahy in May 2016 when it and a rustic bunting, brambling, and oriental turtle dove came aboard a container ship that was en route from China to San Pedro. The dove and hawfinch stayed aboard for most of the crossing, and the hawfinch was still aboard as the vessel passed the Channel Islands and may well have departed for the coast as the ship came within sight of land. Peter looked for it when the boat docked at San Pedro at dawn, and he may have seen it, but wasn't sure. Peter was the chief engineer on the APL China, which was a container ship from 2012 to 2017. He got tired of finding dead passerines on the deck, so he started carrying birdseed aboard the vessel, and he'd spread it around and make sure water was available to give them a fighting chance. Here we have a rustic bunting, and a brambling too, and an old world bunting that unfortunately didn't make it. In October 2014, Peter had 5 to 6 bramblings make it all the way to the California coast. The boat docked in Long Beach, and one brambling was on board at least the day before it docked. The other birds departed the ship prior to docking. Coincidentally, the only 2 Southern California bramblings in LA and Orange County were also October 2014, although I think the LA bird predated the dates of the bird specifically on Peter's ship when it docked. So now to the species themselves. So to clarify, we're not looking at a comprehensive list here tonight. I'm sure at the end of the webinar, there'll be other species that people can think of that have been recorded in the aviary area and other birds that are candidates. We don't have enough time to go through every single species, so I had to cull it down to a somewhat manageable list, or what was perhaps most likely. So to make it on tonight's list, it has either occurred already in the county, or it's a species that has demonstrated some sort of pattern of vagrancy to the West Coast and either has California records or maybe enough of a pattern of ABA records. And we'll only look at those vagrants with fall records too. Just because a species is regular in spring as a vagrant to the Alaskan islands doesn't mean it's a likely candidate to LA County. These spring vagrants are birds, often that are overshooting, drifting as they're heading north and unlikely to turn up in Southern California. Now, there has been early spring records of yellow-browed warbler in Baja and eye-browed thrush in Kern, but it's believed those birds most likely wintered on this side of the Pacific after a fall misorientation and were rerouting north in the spring. Lastly, I have included a few species that check none of these boxes. These would seem to be highly unlikely candidates, except they demonstrate regular vagrancy trends, either around Southeast Asia or to Northwest Europe. And they're also quite similar in plumage, perhaps, to species that are more regular vagrants. So let's start with a group called the Phylloscopus warblers, or Phylosks for short. These old world warblers include some that have occurred more than a few times in the state and even in LA County, such as dusky warbler, wood warbler, and Arctic/Kamchatka. And I've grouped them by wing bars and no wing bars. So to start with are the non-wing bar group. So wood warbler is top left. Of course, pending the CBRC acceptance, this species was added to the county list this year from Brad Dawson's bird in Long Beach. As mentioned earlier, it's a real surprise when you look at its range match. It's deeply European nesting, no closer than central Russia, and it migrates to and from Africa. However, there are now multiple North American records, maybe I think in the double digits now, all from Alaskan islands and all in the fall. In East Asia, there are also records from Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. So perhaps not wholly unexpected. In terms of ID, perhaps its closest looking confusion species, and the one that was also seen in Northern California this year, just a few days later, is willow warbler. So compared to the willow below it, note the really long primaries relative to the tail on wood warbler. This creates this sort of short-tailed look, often very noticeable from below. Note the brighter green upper parts, very bright yellow supercilium and throat. Also, very importantly, wood warbler has very white underwater parts all the way to the vent. Now, the rest of this page are all willow warblers. It's just to show you the huge variation in plumage this species can exhibit. Most birds are somewhat dingy, but you can also get some birds with quite white underparts, although those birds are usually fairly, dull above. Both willow and wood have pale legs, sometimes quite bright pale legs. It should be noted that, the willows we are mostly likely to get here as vagrants are going to be the eastern Yakutensis, which are going to be generally duller birds than some of the brighter birds that we have here. So, particularly look over to the birds to the right. Some of those are obviously quite dull, and I would say, have more than a passing resemblance to dusky warbler, which we'll get to in a moment. Since 2002, when the first willow for North America was found, Gamble's had as many, I think, as 20 willows, all early fall, sometimes multiple birds on the same day. And as we know, there's a bird in Northern California this year. So this bird has to be a contender for LA County. It's a pretty extensive breeding range across Eurasia, breeds as close as Eastern Russia, winters in Africa. Common chiffchaff is unrecorded in California. The first confirmed record for North America was spring 2012 from Gamble. This bird has appeared in the spring at Gamble, and there are a few full records from there too. Although Siberian chiffchaff may breed as close as eastern Russia, much of common chiffchaff's core range is Western Europe, wintering North Africa, South Europe. So with the comparative paucity of records from islands off Alaska, perhaps it's not the highest candidate to turn up in the county, but we ought to be prepared. Chiffchaff and willow warbler can be very hard to separate and confuse. Even very experienced birders, sometimes leave them as a slash. Common chiffchaff has a shorter, more rounded wing, shorter primary projection than that of willow warbler. We have a willow warbler at the bottom there to compare against. Everything else on this slide is a chiffchaff. That shorter primary projection, generally is about half to 2/3 the length of the tertials. Note some of these chiffchaffs are from Europe and maybe a little brighter than the vagrants we'd expect to get here. We're more likely to get Siberian chiffchaff, which is actually the bird on the bottom right. And in general, chiffchaff is drabber than willow warbler, slightly less bright green above, more solid on the underparts, particularly on the flanks. The face pattern is plainer, a little less marked on the lores, weaker supercilium, more sullied ear coverts, sometimes quite a prominent eye ring. You can see that on some of these birds. It sort of dominates the face, gives it a bit of a spectacled appearance. The legs are typically dark, but beware, can be paler on some birds. A characteristic feature of common chiffchaff is its habit of tail dipping. Although occasionally seen in willow warbler, it's sometimes persistent, a little eye-catching in chiffchaff, perhaps maybe a little similar to our palm warbler in that regard. And then I think the other thing that should just be mentioned is, wood, willow, and chiff are not necessarily skulking birds. If you're only experienced with a Phylloscopus, one of the county duskies, do be aware dusky is known for its secretive, skulky behavior, where it's more often heard before it's seen. Wood you're most likely to find in trees, willow and chiffchaff too, but the latter two species are also pretty comfortable lower down in scrub, etc. on migration. There's one other species not shown here, mountain chiffchaff. It's a sandier colored bird, much more range restricted, has some vagrancy tendencies, but a lot less of a pattern to go by. It's unrecorded in North America, so we're not going to spend any time looking at that species tonight. The CBRC, California Bird Record Committee, has 23 accepted records of dusky warbler for the state, with the first in 1980, and there were standout years of 97 and 2017 having multiple birds. The pace of dusky discovery in the state has really picked up in recent years, with 9 recorded from 1980 to 2000, and then 14 in the next 20 years. Of the cluster of birds in Southern California, ranging from Santa Barbara down to San Diego, as well as one in Desert, all have been found in early to mid-October. LA fits right within that pattern, although one of the LA birds was found on the last day of September. LA's had 3 birds, and they've all been since 2017. Perhaps the most likely confusion species, if you come across a potential dusky, is chiffchaff and Siberian chiffchaff, which is the most likely form we're going to get. It can be very similar in teed. We've got Siberian over there to the right, and also a Siberian below a dusky there. All is not lost. They may all look identical. Dusky is often, quite vocal. It gives a Lincoln sparrow-like check call, tends to stay low on the ground, deep in cover. Its behavior is quite similar to a yellowthroat in that regard. Often the first sign of a dusky is its call. Chiffchaff, on the other hand, is a softer. It's got a huit call. It's maybe more likely to be silent than a dusky, and also maybe more likely to be feeding out in the open. Notice the darker legs of chiffchaff and the less contrasting supercilium and face pattern in general. Generally, chiffchaff is duller and less contrasting than dusky. Now, when you're faced with a dusky, let's say you've eliminated chiffchaff, it's always good to rule out some other confusion species. Now, these are unrecorded in North America, so maybe don't take this too seriously. But Rad's warbler, over on the right there, does breed across Southeast Siberia, winter Southeast Asia. It's a regular vagrant to Northwest Europe, so would seem to be a candidate for vagrancy to one of the vagrant traps, one of the islands off Alaska, I imagine. And in turn, perhaps eventually then maybe it becomes a candidate for California too. It's got a stout bill, which is sort of short, blunt-tipped. The supercilium is sort of diffuse to the front of the eye, sort of fairly warm-colored, slightly paler, whiter along the rear. Tends to look sturdier than dusky, you know, being slightly larger with more deliberate movements, has regular tail flicks, swivels of the rear end when it's nervous. And when it does, it will show off its undertail coverts, which are sort of an apricot buff. The legs are thicker than dusky, paler colored. Best separated through a combination of features, and if heard, the call differs from the harsh chack of dusky, being slightly softer. There's also yellow-streaked warbler, breeds in northeast China. There's no data on long-range vagrancy, so probably not a bird to take too seriously, but at least something to be aware of in an ID context. Very similar to Rad's, distinguished by slightly smaller size and head, thinner bill and legs, proportionally longer tail, and a more uniformly colored supercilium. Supercilium may show some contrast, but generally less so than Rad's. Now onto the wing bar group. So there's 10 records of Arctic Kamchatka for California. In 2011, Arctic warbler was split into 3 species. So we have now Arctic, Kamchatka, and Japanese leaf warblers. Arctic ranges across northern Eurasia and into Alaska, and we have 1 county record of Arctic/Kamchatka from DeForest Park in Long Beach. Kamchatka, on the other hand, ranges from southern Kamchatka, Sakhalin, Hokkaido, and the Kuril Islands. And Japanese leaf warbler is mainly found in Japan. CBRC treats Arctic as a slash, and they can only really be separated in the field on the call. So there are /Arctic/Kamchatka. So if you come across a suspected Arctic type, turn your phone recorder on while watching it. Maybe you'll get lucky, maybe you'll catch a call, or if it should shed some feathers or poop or something, carefully collect that in a Ziploc bag for DNA analysis. On the right, we have some other very similar looking birds. We have eastern crowned warbler, not recorded in the ABA area, so maybe we shouldn't worry about it too much. But in recent years, there have been a number of records from Western Europe, perhaps indicating its tendency for far-flung vagrancy, and it's similar enough to Arctic that it could be mis-ID'd. Note the darker, grayer eye stripe and crown, and on well-marked birds is distinctive pale median stripe that broadens at the back of the crown. I've added a couple of links here. First is to the Alstrom paper that has detailed analysis of the spectrograms. And the second link has some in-hand comparison pics of Kamchatka versus nominate Arctic. Now, you know, we've only really scratched the surface here. There are other very similar species such as sulphur-bellied warbler, pale-legged leaf warbler, Sakhalin leaf warblers. None have occurred in the AB area, but they have occurred as vagrants in Northwest Europe. So they are a possibility, but seems a little unlikely that Los Angeles would score one of these before Alaska does. The first North American record of yellow-browed warbler was in Gamble in 1999, but since then, Alaska and islands have notched up double digits of this species. California has 1 state record, Alpine County in 2019, not from the coast where you might expect it. Same year, there was also 1 in British Columbia. A spring bird was discovered in Baja, where perhaps it overwintered, but there are also records now from Wisconsin and in Ontario, Canada. It's a regular scarce migrant to Northwestern Europe, a distance equivalent from its core range to West Coast North America. So this, to me, feels like a very strong candidate for Southern California and, in turn, LA County. And in terms of ID, not that hard. You'll find it in the trees rather than skulking on the ground. In fact, all the birds on this page are generally tree dwellers. Yellow-browed is a small kinglet-type bird, but with a supercilium and 2 bold wing bars. And it can be quite vocal too. And often the first clue to its presence is its call, and it's actually quite loud for a small bird. It's actually superficially similar to Swinhoe's white-eye. I had a minor heart attack on Catalina this fall from a hidden white-eye calling away in a ficus, and I'd actually forgotten that white-eyes now occurred on Catalina. but you may well hear this bird and have your attention drawn to it. Now, with a suspected yellow-browed, there are a couple of other birds to rule out. There's something called Hume's warbler, very similar. It's over here on the right-hand side. It's generally duller, has a slightly different call. It's a rare but somewhat regular vagrant to northwestern Europe. Has not occurred in North America, but as I say, it's occurred enough as a vagrant in northwestern Europe, even attempted to overwinter. It seems like there's a possibility that may well occur at some point in the not too distant future. And then this other stunner on the bottom row here is called Pallas's leaf warbler, or the seven-striped sprite, as it's affectionately called. That seventh stripe being that pale yellow median crown stripe. It also has a yellow rump as well. It always reminds me of one of those birds at the beginning of field guides where they try and point out the different parts of the bird's body. This bird has everything. It has color in every different part of its body. It's got a fantastic head pattern there. You can see quite more contrasting than the yellow-browed. And again, if you get good views, you can see the median stripe and that yellow rump. Paul Lehman found the first and only North American record in Gamble in 2006. But it is a very regular late fall vagrant to northwestern Europe. So it's capable of long distance vagrancy, and Pallas's should always be checked if you are thinking you have a suspected yellow-browed. Now onto the pipits. Red-throated pipit here is one of the more regularly occurring Palearctic passerines in the county. It breeds from Scandinavia across northern Eurasia to the Chukotsky Peninsula and even to parts of Alaska. It feels like out of all the birds tonight, this would be the one you would have the best chance of finding yourself. The first records were in 1964 when an astonishing 17 were in the Tijuana River Valley. It was then only found sporadically between 64 and 77, and then went on to be almost annual through to 1991, when the CBRC no longer reviewed records of this species. In LA, you could find it wherever you could find American pipits: open grassy areas, playing fields. Notice that well-streaked back with those pale mantle braces, the black and white streaked underparts, the pale pink legs, and that pale yellowish base to the bill. And if the rump is seen well, it's streaked, which separates it from tree and olive-backed. Its call is loud and very diagnostic, and unlike American pipit, a long, drawn-out, high-pitched C call. Japonicus pipit, or sometimes it's called Siberian or Japanese pipit, is the Palearctic subspecies of American pipit. Has also occurred in the county. It breeds in eastern Siberia, winters in southern Asia. For this bird, you're looking at a combination of bright pink legs, white underparts, bold streaking that forms a necklace around the throat, a white eye ring, and thin white wing bars. That upper wing bar is thinner white crescents compared to the average American pipit. American pipit is very variable, so it's a combination of characteristics that you need to see here. And this is a bird you could also find in a flock of American pipits. Then we move on to olive-backed pipit. That's not occurred in LA, and there are only 2 records for the state, but one of those was in neighboring Orange County. So has to be a contender. More olive tones, the upper parts, whiter underparts, that broad supercilium edged in black, and a pale and dark spot at the rear of the ear coverts is distinctive. Now, this species I don't think you will find among a flock of American pipits on a sports field. This is a pipit of more wooded areas, perhaps parks with trees, likes to feed on the ground, but generally more retiring than the average American pipit. And then lastly on this slide, we have Pechora pipit, which has not occurred in California. This is a darker, more contrasting pipit. Notice the dark upper part and underpart streaking, those pale mantle braces and wing bars, a bit more contrasting than red-throated, thick malar, quite a distinctive face pattern that often has rufous tones in it. And it does also have a streaked rump like red-throated. It's very white below, but critically note there's a very short primary projection that's not present on red-throated. Its call is also distinct from red-throated as well. Red-throated has that drawn high-pitched C call compared to Pechora's buzzy chip. This is another retiring pipit that I wouldn't expect to find wandering around open grassy fields with American pipit flocks. It'll likely be in tall grass, thick vegetation, weedy fields, and your first view will be when you flush it. Tree pipit is unrecorded in California, and its range of Western Europe, wintering in Africa and India, may not lend itself to a likely bird to occur in the county, let alone the state, but there have been a number of full records from the Alaskan Islands and Japan. So it needs to be eliminated if looking at a potential olive-backed or even red-throated. Both tree and olive-backed calls are very similar, may not be safely separable unless you have a lot of experience with both. It has a short, buzzy call, unlike red-throated. Again, like Pechora and olive-backed, it's a little more retiring pipit, not a bird you'll likely find in a flock of Americans. And while you could find migrants out on short grass, often migrants can be found in areas with a bit more habitat, longer grass, hedgerows, trees, again, where your first sight of it might be when you accidentally flush it. Tree pipit has a more boldly marked back than olive-backed here. And olive-backed has more olive tones to its upper parts. On olive-backed, that face pattern is more complex, with that bolder supercilium, which is buff in front of the eye, small dark and pale spots at the rear of the ear coverts. These are classic features of olive-backed. Tree is similar to red-throated, but often no mantle braces and more buffy tones to underparts. Note the head pattern. It also has that pale spot at the rear of the ear coverts like olive-backed does, but it's not bordered by that dark at the bottom of the ear coverts. Here's a page of fanciful options, none recorded in the AB area, so beyond unlikely as a candidate in the county. But while we're here, why not? Let's be aware of them. They show a tendency for vagrancy to Western Europe. Richard's pipit breeds in eastern Siberia, winters Southeast Asia, strong predilection for long wayward westward movement, to the point where it's not really considered a vagrant there anymore. Its wanderings, as we mentioned earlier, have actually led to new wintering grounds in Western Europe. So it could imply that it's got a chance to turn up on the West Coast. Although you'd expect, for all of these birds, you'd expect the first records would come from Alaska. It's a big pipit, long legs, long tail, limited streaking on the underparts, distinctive house sparrow-like cheep call. Perhaps Sprague's pipit is somewhat similar in terms of face pattern, but structurally, you can see this thing is an absolute monster. And you can look at see the hind claw on that thing is amazing as well. Bly's pipit needs to be considered too, extremely similar to Richard's. Its range is southern Russia, Mongolia, winters in Southeast Asia. It's got some history of vagrancy to Northwest Europe, where its ID is becoming a bit better known. It's slightly shorter tailed than Richard's, slightly different shape and pattern to the median coverts, a little more squared off. And it's shorter build and has a shorter hind claw. And lastly, including meadow pipit here, it's another Western European species, no history of vagrancy I can find to Russia or East Asia. So we seem to be highly unlikely as a candidate. It's a very variable looking bird. Classic birds have yellowish tones, but some can actually look quite similar to red-throated pipit, quite cold. Its call is very helpful though, and out of all these pipits, it's most similar, its call is to American pipit, and quite unlike the calls of the other species we've covered. Onto wagtails. I've picked young and fall birds here because those are the most likely plumages to occur, and they're all very similar looking wagtails. So eastern yellow wagtail ranges into Alaska. So not surprising, we've had a couple of county records as well as birds turning up in neighboring counties and also down south as far as Baja. There's about 30 California records for this. There's one December record of citrine from Central California, as well as one from British Columbia, and an extraordinary winter record from Mississippi. But there was also one from Alaska earlier this year, but puzzlingly none from the Alaskan Islands. Its breeding range is a little further west than some of the more regularly occurring vagrants on the Alaska Islands, so maybe that's to do with it. In terms of ID, again, if you come across a suspected yellow wagtail, it's always good to be sure it's not a citrine. On citrine, note that pale surround to the ear coverts and a slight dark shadow over the supercilium. Those wing bars are thinner, generally less white in the wing compared to white wagtail. And again, comparing to white wagtail, note the difference in the ear coverts. White wagtail, ocularis shown here at the top, and black-backed were split by the AAU in 1982 and then lumped in 2005, with much debate centering on how much hybridization occurs in Russia. Both forms have occurred in LA County in recent years. Ocularis is bred in Alaska, so its range extends to North America, whereas black-backed is rarer. Sibley has a great online article on the subtle differences between the two, but note the more white-winged black-backed shown here. In terms of habitat, white wagtails can be found in very urban settings and rocky shorelines. Indeed, the most recent ones have been quite happy feeding around the spillways along the concrete lined LA River. Yellow and citrine, on the other hand, usually require habitat, marshes, wet fields, etc. Both LA County yellows were at Malibu Lagoon, and I would imagine any citrine that turns up in the county would also be in similar habitat to that. Call is a very good indicator if you're unsure of the ID. Wagtails often call in flight. White wagtail has a sparrow-like two-part call, whereas yellow and citrine has this piercing C call, not too dissimilar to red-throated pipit. Eurasian skylark has a few California records, so perhaps that's a candidate for Southern California. There was the famous returning wintering bird at Point Reyes from the late 70s to the early 80s, but there has also been a few late fall, early winter records from Northern California. It's a regular fall vagrant on the Alaskan islands, and even though there's an introduced population in Hawaii, it's occurred as a vagrant to Midway. There's a small introduced population in British Columbia that still persists, that can potentially muddy the waters, but birds that have been found in fall and winter along the Pacific coast and Alaska islands are generally considered legitimate vagrants. Note, it can be crested. Its crest is up and down in both of these pictures. It can look like a large pipit or perhaps a longspur or perhaps even a vesper sparrow might be a confusion species. In flight, it's got these fairly broad wings that look quite dark on the underside. Note that bill shape, and note the white outer tail feathers and particularly that white trailing edge on the secondaries in flight. It favors long grass, stubble fields, generally not very confiding. Again, a bird you may flush is your first sign of seeing it. Oriental skylark, another very similar bird, unrecorded, but it could be a reverse migrant. Very difficult ID, generally look for shorter tailed bird, looks a bit more dumpy in flight, less obvious white trailing edge. We also have woodlark here. It's unrecorded in North America, unlikely, again, like Oriental skylark. It's a shorter distant migrant, but it can be found in winter in Iran on the eastern edge of its range. And so, who knows? Redback shrike has a not too dissimilar range, and that's a species that's occurred in the ABA area. So it's just a bird to be aware of if you think you found a Eurasian lark. It's pretty short tail, quite a distinctive face pattern compared to skylark, pale surround to the ear coverts, pale superciliums that meet in a V at the nape. Again, like skylark, can be found in stubble fields. The wheatears all have generally pretty distinctive tail patterns, which is best seen in flight. They have white tails with a black T, a bit like a thick-billed longspur. And they'll often show their tails as they feed. They're a bird of open habitat, playing fields, fence post, sort of think Say's Phoebe, habits as they fly up and down from posts, quite comfortable on the ground. There's over 20 records of northern wheatear in California, including 3 records for LA. Malibu, San Clemente fit the pattern of coastal locations, but there is one late fall record from La Mirada, which reminds us that these vagrants can turn up anywhere. So it would certainly be well received if there was another more accessible one that stuck around in the county. To me, it most reminds me of female mountain bluebird, generally in behavior and looks. But again, in flight, look for that striking black and white tail pattern. The other birds on here are unlikely. Pied wheatear has occurred in the ABA area, 1 record. If you're lucky enough to find one, hopefully it's a male and it's got a dark throat and dark wings. Otherwise, you're trying to separate sort of female immatures from eastern black-eared wheatear, which is incredibly difficult. Isabella in wheatear, no ABA records, but its range extends across Mongolia. And there are vagrant records from Southeast Asia, notably Japan. It occurs as a late fall vagrant in Northwest Europe, so with some frequency. So, it's a plausible candidate. And it's got a similar range to pied wheatear, which has occurred in the ABA area. So, it's a possibility. It's a paler, sandier bird than northern, longer billed, longer legged, stockier bird. There are other plumage features as well. So I would check the Collins guide on that. The CBRC is 2 oriental turtle doves with a 3rd well-seen bird from earlier this year in review. Late fall winter is the pattern so far, so it could be a candidate for the county, perhaps as ship assistance even. There are 5 accepted California records for red-flanked bluetail, and we had a famous wintering bird in downtown LA, actually the 2nd county record after one on San Clemente. Southeast Farallon has the other 3. And it's had a remarkable series of showings, red-flanked bluetail, in recent years, a number of inland birds in the lower 48, as well as wintering birds along the Pacific Northwest coast. It's mirrored by a large increase in records in Northwestern Europe too, generally attributed to a Western breeding range expansion. Generally a shy bird, deep cover. Young birds got a pretty distinctive combination of white throat, orange on the flanks, and bluetail, but this actually feels like a bird that may well occur again in the not too distant future. Stonechat is on here. Siberian stonechat is part of a very complex clade of stonechats that range across Eurasia and also includes Amur stonechat. They're all very similar looking. There's one Alaska specimen that points to Amur, and I think the assumption is the other Alaska records also refer to that as well. Some authorities split Siberian Amur, and there are further potential splits to come. There is one record from LA County from the mid-90s on San Clemente. So, it's another bird to obviously look out for. It's a small, short-tailed insectivore with white in the wings and tail, often perches in the open, has a sharp chat call. It might remind you of a flycatcher. Indeed, the San Clemente bird was initially thought to be a vermilion flycatcher, which is very understandable. Eurasian Wryneck. This is a fantastic bird. It's part of the woodpecker family, but you'll be more likely to find this medium-sized bird feeding on the ground on ants, other insects, than you will find it in a tree knocking on the wood. It's amazing plumage and its ability to twist, contort its neck when displaying and feeling threatened. There are a couple of records from Gamble and also mainland Alaska, but LA County again has a record, a bird from San Clemente Island a few years ago. It maybe gives hope of a mainland bird one day. Not much to really confuse this bird with from an ID point of view, and it probably is the most amazing passerine you'll ever lay your eyes on. There's just one accepted greenfinch record for the state, initially not accepted due to the possibility of an escape. It was then re-reviewed and accepted. There are also records from Oregon, British Columbia, as well as multiple spring full records from the Alaskan islands. So a bird in Southern California is a possibility, although I have a feeling it would likely have the same specter hanging over it of ship assistance or being an escape. Blue throat, only accepted California record is from LA County again, San Clemente, 2008. Species range, it breeds from Alaska, extends to Alaska. I think perhaps what hinders its ability to get detected more often is its secretive nature, very retiring. On migration, it can be found in thick cover, especially like wet areas, edge of reed beds. I would think sort of Madrona Marsh, Malibu Legacy Park, those are sort of perfect habitat for it. It's a pretty striking passerine with a bold supercilium, some dark markings on the throat and the malar. A full juvenile won't have much blue on its throat, but its tail in flight is striking, really bright chestnut patches at the base of the tail, unlike any other North American passerine. California has one tiger flycatcher record from 2006, but it is a casual full vagrant to the Western Aleutians, Pribilofs. It's pretty nondescript, but it has this striking tail pattern in flight with large white patches at the base of the tail. Again, it doesn't really feel like it's a confusion for any other North American passerine. This bird is perched here in very typical posture, wings drooped, tail cocked. Maybe American redstart is the most similar looking in terms of sort of structure and behavior. And then these other flycatchers on the right here, dark-sided, gray-sided. gray streak, sorry, are specialties of the Alaskan islands, often in spring. Not sure they're serious contenders for Southern California, but they do turn up enough as vagrants in Alaska that they need to be mentioned as a possibility. Gray-streaked is a little more frequent as a vagrant in fall to the islands than dark-sided. It's hard to know what these birds might be confused with. Perhaps you might think you have an odd peewee or an olive-sided flycatcher, something like that. The ID between these two is very difficult, certainly outside of the scope of tonight's webinar, but there is plenty online. And then there is also spotted flycatcher. Lehman had the first and only North American record in 2002 on Gamble. So there's no pattern to North American vagrancy, but it does have a very similar range and migration map to wood warbler. So again, we need to be at least aware of it. It's somewhat similar to gray streaked, but it has lighter spotting on the breast, less of an eye ring, and generally browner. Common rosefinch feels like a species we should at least have on our radar for ID purposes. There's one record from Southeast Farallon, September 2007, and multiple full records from St. Paul and Gamble, so definitely a possibility. Its extreme likeness in juvenile and female plumage to housefinch is probably its biggest hindrance to one being found. But note those wide double wing bars, the shorter, more conical bill, that beady eye. There's a certain sort of teddy bear cuteness to this otherwise incredibly bland bird. Young birds often have olive tones to the plumage and wings that you don't generally see on housefinch. Perhaps also compare this bird to, say, an indigo or lazuli bunting. We're getting towards the end here. Bear with me. We're on to buntings now. There are 4 accepted California records of little bunting, including one from San Diego, and records from Baja and Arizona. So clearly vagrants can wander south. This might be a tricky bird to find, though. It's savanna sparrow size, likes to feed in arable fields, hedgerows, but a vagrant could be found in one of our parks. In flight, it gives this distinctive tick call. Could perhaps be confused with a North American sparrow, but really with good views. It has a pretty distinctive plumage. Maybe Vesper sparrow is the closest bird we have to it in terms of looks, with that eye ring. There are 5 accepted rustic buntings for the state, including a very well-watched bird that overwintered in San Francisco, 2014, 2015. Large bunting, somewhat crested with a very distinctive head batten. Similar habitat to little bunting, and it's a candidate to be found as a wintering vagrant, I think, in Southern California. Yellow-breasted bunting, unfortunately, has suffered a dramatic population decline over the past 20 years or so through overhunting and collecting across Southeast Asia. As a result, its prospects for vagrancy are very dim indeed. There have been some full records from Alaska, including this past fall on Shemya. There are 2 unaccepted records for California, including one from LA County. Black-faced bunting is unrecorded in the ABA area, so not a likely candidate, but it's shown it's a proven vagrant to Northwest Europe. So perhaps look out for the first record on an Alaskan island at some point. And then not shown here is Pallas's bunting, which has had a number of records from Alaska islands. And there's also yellow-browed bunting, which is, again, not pictured. Sorry, I do have Pallas's there. But yellow-browed is not pictured. There's one full record from Gamble, looks very superficially similar to white-throated sparrow. There's 5 state records of brown shrike after the first on Southeast Farallon in 1984. It's described as casual in fall on Gamble, where the first North American record was described in 1977. Since then, there have been records in the Pacific Northwest, but unfortunately, it strayed no closer to us in Northern California. It breeds as far northeast as the Anadir Basin, so very close proximity to the west coast of North America. It winters across Southeast Asia, and so has a migration route like dusky warbler and would seem to be a likely candidate for us. There are no state records for red-backed shrike, that's the bird below it. However, there was an exceptional red-backed, red-tailed Turkestan shrike hybrid in Mendocino in 2015. Red-backed has a range not too dissimilar from wood warbler, and there have been records from Japan and Taiwan, and most importantly, since the first North American record in 2017 on Gamble, there's since been birds in British Columbia in 2020, and I think this year on Shemya Island. Identification between brown and red-backed. Adults are fairly straightforward, but first winters, what we're looking at here, are much harder. Brown, in comparison, has this uniform, richer brown from crown to mantle, darker ear coverts, whereas red-backed is paler, often with a contrasting paler crown. Structurally, brown is shortest wing, shortest primary projection, longest tail, and it's also deepest build of all the Palearctic shrikes on this page. Immatures between red-tailed and Isabelline, exceptionally tough. Out of the scope of this webinar, there is overlap, but on immatures, generally Isabelline is less contrast between the upper and underparts compared to red-tailed. Isabelline is more uniformly warm buff. It's got paler, gingery mantle and crown, and red-tailed generally darker. And the centers of the greater coverts tend to be darker, contrasting more with the paler edges. I included a northern shrike here. You know, in a North American context, this is probably the closest confusion species with these shrikes. You know, often shows barring on the underparts. Some birds, some northerns can look a little buffish, brownish as well. Although obviously if you find a northern, that would be a great bird for LA County as well. All these thrushes here, approximately the size of American robin, all pretty striking and bold. You know, maybe eyebrow thrush has the most similarity to a young American robin. I've put one there next to it. So, you know, care must be taken if you think you may have an eyebrow thrush. But in general, these are pretty easy to ID. And I think, you know, they could probably all be found with robin flocks, or at least in the similar sort of habitat. Eyebrowed is the only one here with actually a single accepted California record. It was a remarkable spring bird in a desert migrant trap. You know, perhaps it had wintered further south, was moving north in the spring. It's very rare, spring, casual fall vagrant to the Aleutian Islands, unknown from elsewhere in the lower 48, so it would seem very unlikely as a candidate. Dusky thrush on this page seems the most likely of this group, you know, to surprise us with a county record. You know, there are records now reaching as far south as British Columbia and Oregon. Very distinctive bird. Red-winged fieldfare been recorded from British Columbia and Washington State, and fieldfare even has an interior record from Montana. And lastly, let's finish with a mix of candidates and some also-rans. We've got common cuckoo, which has occurred in California, a well-watched bird in September 2012 in Santa Cruz County. There've only been full records, there've only been a few full records from the Alaskan Islands and a couple from the East Coast. So the California bird, bit of a surprise in that context. Oriental cuckoo, very similar, only has a few full records from places like Gamble, St. Paul, and Adak. Most cuckoo records from Gamble and Western Alaska in the fall are oriental, whereas common is mostly a spring vagrant there. In terms of identification, very distinctive, very falcon-like. If you see one in flight, you probably will think you're looking at a merlin or something. Siberian Ascenter in the middle there has had over 30 records on Gamble alone, a number of winter records from the interior states and British Columbia and also Washington State, but surprisingly none from California. It doesn't winter that far south in its native range, e.g. central China, Korea, so perhaps Southern California might be a little far south to find a wintering bird. But, you know, it's also shown plenty of vagrancy to northwestern Europe, as well as Japan. So this has to be a reasonably high candidate to turn up in California, even if LA County is a bit of a long shot. And then European robin is a bit of a bonkers bird to have on here. Its core range is Europe, and it's not what you would consider a long-distance migrant capable of making a transoceanic journey. But there have been vagrants across Asia, and it's been recorded in China, South Korea, and Japan. And I believe there was a tantalizing report of one in the fall in Northern California recently. I'm not sure of its cage bird status, but I think if one did turn up in LA in the winter, you'd have to consider it as a possible wild bird, but no doubt it would be tainted by the ship assistance or the escapee possibility. And then lastly, rufous-tailed robin, there's just a few full records from the Alaska Islands. I've mostly included it here because its similarity to the North American thrushes, perhaps hermit thrush, might be the biggest confusion species for us. So a lot to take in. I had to whiz through it quickly. I do recommend if you're interested, get some of those books, take some time to read it. And lastly, because I said it was such an outstanding bird, here's a good way to end tonight's webinar. Here's a Wryneck doing what its name says. And that's my webinar.
That was an incredible webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Yeah. Whistle Stop Tour. We should do an ID quiz now.
If somebody else does it, not me.
If you have any questions for Andy, please put them into the Q&A down at the bottom. It helps us keep track of everything. And
so Andy, what's a good source for recordings of these of these potential migrants? I mean, you provided some books, but I think the recording, is it Xenocanto or where would you?
It'd be the usual place. Xenocanto is excellent for that stuff. Yes, it's that, and there's a few links that, if this goes up online later, there are a few links to those ID articles, and some of them have great links about particularly the Arctic/Kamchatka problem. There were some great online articles about how you could possibly separate them on call, and in addition to going to Xenocanto. But yeah, I would bookmark that site.
okay, that sounds good. And Andy, I was kind of disappointed that you actually didn't give us your choice, and so I happen to bring my crystal ball with me. And so if you could use it to just kind of give us your top 3 possibilities.
I would say yellow-browed warbler has to be in it. It feels like willow warbler. There's been so many records now, and now Northern California is part of it. I guess I could see something like oriental turtle dove or a rustic bunting. I feel like it's one of those two. I'll go for rustic bunting. I think,
okay.
I think we'll have a wintering rustic bunting in Griffith Park sometime.
Here we go.
That'll
and I won't find it, because I'll be on Catalina.
Someone else will find it.
I'll be on Catalina dipping oriental turtle dove that can be found.
Or the yellow-browed warbler that's that's sitting with the Swinhoe's white eyes.
Exactly.
Excellent. And I think everyone's pretty well stunned by that, as Lance calls it, a tour de force, which absolutely is true.
It was a little long. I'm sorry. I tried to.
It was fantastic.
It really was fantastic. And one of the wonderful things about LA Birders is we record them so people can go back and take little chunks at a time.
Right. Mm-hmm. I think the bottom line is we probably could have ended at like the 3rd slide, and I could have just said, just go get the Collins guide and get those other books, and you're set.
Yeah. So we do have a question from Alex. Alex asked, this is a long shot, but is there any information on if these birds ever head back to their natural range, or if they're ever seen again in the area where they appear?
Yeah.
It is a long shot, but there is evidence, and to go back to that Richard's pipit example, these birds were thousands of miles out of their range, and that study that was a paper that was published just a couple of years ago by a couple of French ornithologists, where they wanted to answer that question. Birds keep showing up in this area. What happens to them? And they did put tracking on them, and they went back to their native range. So yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, even just things like that cerulean warbler, like where did that, if we assume it didn't die, and maybe it did, but did that thing just keep heading west? Did it just head out over the Pacific, or do some of these birds try and orient back? But there certainly is evidence, and there are banding recoveries of birds of these Palearctic migrants that do seem to look like they are somewhat course correcting sometimes. So.
Well, or if they're mirroring back the other way as well.
Yeah, maybe.
Or whatever migration error they're making.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be fascinating. Where did that wood warbler go? Did that just keep
Right.
And if the weather hadn't made it stop, would it have ever been found, or would it have just perished in the ocean? You know, what crazy route was it on? You know, no one will ever know. But
Absolutely.
maybe as technology improves, we'll start to get answers on these things.
Yeah, and Laz asks if anyone's still checking the wood warbler. I haven't seen any
Yeah, I think that's been
any
something
word
for
on
a
it.
long time. Yeah, I think people did look. It was very odd. People looked for it for a couple of days. It disappeared, and then some people had it again. 2 or 3 days later, just briefly, there were only people who had it and then gone again. So
Yeah.
it's strange.
Yeah.
But no, I think it's gone. There was somebody asking on the WhatsApp group for somebody who was coming down from Northern California for it, and that was just like a couple of weeks ago. And I don't know if I invest too much time in looking for that, but
Yeah. Lots of other vagrants to find in the meantime.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, I think we are slowing down on, well, stopping on questions. And with that, I would really like to thank you, Andy, for a wonderful, wonderful presentation.
Yep. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Very
Fantastic.
comprehensive, really a lot to
Yeah.
think about.
And just as a reminder to everyone, all our webinars are recorded and are available on our website at labirders.org. You can go back and digest Andy's presentation a little in smaller bites and all that, and it's absolutely wonderful. And with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful Thanksgiving. And we have some wonderful webinars coming up in the future. Please join us and join us for other activities and community science projects. And in the meantime, happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Happy
Yep.
Thanksgiving.
Thank you, Andy. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks
Yeah.
again, Andy.
Bye.
Good night, everybody.
Good night,
night.
everyone.
Bye.
Good night.